The murmur of passengers settling into their seats filled the plane as the cabin crew prepared for takeoff. The hum of engines vibrated beneath the floor, mingling with snippets of conversations, the click of seatbelts, and overhead bins snapping shut. Among the crowded cabin, an air of unease started to spread, but not because of turbulence. It was coming from one specific row, near the middle of the aircraft. "I'm not sitting next to him," a shrill voice cut through the murmurs. Heads turned as a blonde woman in her mid-40s, dressed in designer clothes and clutching a Louis Vuitton tote, pointed an accusing finger at a young black man seated next to her. The man looked up, his calm demeanor betraying no sign of the tension brewing. His dark green hoodie bore the insignia of the U.S. Army, and his posture was that of someone trained to remain composed under pressure. But it was clear the woman didn't care. Her sneer deepened as she directed her anger toward the flight attendant, now hurrying down the aisle. "Ma'am, please lower your voice," the flight attendant said, her voice gentle but firm. "What seems to be the issue?" "This is the issue," the woman snapped, gesturing wildly toward the man, who still hadn't spoken a word. "I paid for this seat, and I won't spend the next 4 hours cramped beside someone like him." The flight attendant blinked, momentarily stunned. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Are you referring to—" "Don't play dumb," the woman hissed. "I have the right to request a seat change, don't I?" The young man finally spoke, his voice steady and quiet. "Ma'am, I'm just here to get to Atlanta, same as you. I don't want any trouble." But his calm response only seemed to fuel her rage. "Trouble? I don't want any trouble either. But let's be honest, some of us don't belong in certain places." Gasps rippled through the nearby rows as passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances. The young man's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed ahead as if willing the moment to pass. A little girl across the aisle whispered to her mother, "Why is she being mean to him?" The flight attendant straightened, clearly trying to defuse the situation. "Ma'am, this gentleman has every right to sit here. If you'd prefer, I can check if there's another seat available for you." "Good," the woman spat, her tone triumphant. "Because I'm not staying here." The attendant moved to check the manifest, leaving the woman standing in the aisle, her arms crossed and her glare fixed on the man. Passengers whispered among themselves, some looking uncomfortable, others openly disapproving. But no one said anything. Then, a voice broke the silence. "You ought to be ashamed," an elderly man across the aisle said, his tone sharp. He looked directly at the woman, his piercing blue eyes brimming with indignation. "This young man hasn't done anything to you. Why don't you sit down and stop embarrassing yourself?" The woman's face turned red, but she didn't back down. "Mind your business, old man," she snapped, though her voice wavered slightly. The young man finally looked up, his gaze meeting the elderly man's with a nod of gratitude. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. Before the argument could escalate further, the flight attendant returned. "Ma'am, there's an empty seat in the back if you'd like to move." "Fine," the woman huffed, grabbing her tote and storming down the aisle. As she passed, she shot one last glare at the young man. Unbelievable. The tension lingered even after she was gone. The passengers around the young man offered him sympathetic smiles and words of support, but he simply nodded and leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as if to block out the world. The plane took off, and the flight proceeded uneventfully, at least on the surface. But beneath the calm exterior, emotions churned. The young man replayed the encounter in his mind, the sting of her words gnawing at him despite his training to rise above such things. And in the back of the plane, the woman sat with her arms crossed, still fuming, oblivious to the murmurs of passengers who had witnessed her outburst. The next morning, everything changed. The woman, sipping her coffee in the comfort of her suburban kitchen, turned on the news. The headline flashed across the screen, accompanied by a photograph of the young man from the plane. Local hero returns. Army sergeant saves lives overseas, quietly helps veterans back home. Her coffee cup froze halfway to her lips as the anchor continued, detailing the soldier's heroic actions during a mission in Afghanistan. He had single-handedly rescued 5 civilians trapped in a burning building while under enemy fire. The report showed interviews with the people he'd saved, who described him as fearless, humble, and kind. The woman's face drained of color. Her hands trembled as she set the coffee cup down, her mind racing. Memories of the previous day flooded back, the disdain in her voice, the look on his face as she insulted him in front of everyone. Her stomach twisted with guilt as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. But the next segment hit even harder. The reporter shifted to another story, highlighting the soldier's work with veterans struggling with PTSD. He had founded a non-profit organization that provided counseling, job training, and housing assistance to former service members. One of the veterans choked up as he described how the young man had saved his life in more ways than one. "He's a true hero," the veteran said, his voice cracking. "And he doesn't ask for recognition. He just cares about people." The woman sank into her chair, her hands covering her face. The weight of her actions pressed down on her like a physical force. She had humiliated a man who had risked everything for his country, who had dedicated his life to helping others. And she had done it without a second thought. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the screen. What could she do now? Was there any way to make this right? Or was it too late? The weight of guilt sat heavy on her chest as the woman stared at the television, unable to look away from the soldier's image on the screen. Her mind reeled with shame, replaying her behavior on the plane over and over again. She hadn't just insulted a man. She had disrespected a hero, a person who had saved lives, endured unimaginable horrors, and returned home to quietly make the world a better place. And what had she done? Judged him based on his skin color before she even knew his name. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She opened a social media app, typing in the soldier's name, which had appeared at the bottom of the screen during the news broadcast. His profile popped up immediately. The page was filled with photos of his nonprofit's work, images of veterans smiling, families being reunited, and events meant to bring hope to those who needed it most. One post, however, froze her in her tracks. It was from just a few hours ago, a simple, unassuming caption beneath a photo of him boarding a plane, heading home to Atlanta after a long mission, grateful for the chance to serve. Never stop fighting. Grateful heart. She felt her stomach twist again. The man she had insulted on the flight had likely posted this after enduring weeks, maybe even months, of deployment, only to return to his country and face someone like her. Someone who had belittled him simply for existing. Tears pricked her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away. What kind of person had she become? How could she have been so blinded by her own prejudices? Her fingers hovered over the message button on his profile. "Apologize," a voice in her head urged. But what could she say? Would an apology even matter at this point? Or would it just seem hollow, an afterthought meant to ease her own guilt rather than truly make amends? Before she could think too much, she typed a quick message and hit send. "Hello, this is the woman from the flight yesterday. I am deeply sorry for how I treated you. I was wrong in every way, and I realize now how much harm I caused. You didn't deserve any of it. Please forgive me." She stared at the screen, watching the message delivery indicator change to seen. Her heart pounded in her chest. Would he respond? Would he even bother reading her words? She braced herself for silence, or worse, a message of well-earned anger. Her phone buzzed moments later. She glanced at the screen, her breath catching. "It's never too late to do the right thing," his response began. Thank you for reaching out. We all make mistakes, but how we handle them afterward is what matters. I forgive you." The relief that washed over her was immediate, but it was short-lived. Forgiveness, she realized, didn't erase what had happened. It didn't undo the pain she'd caused or the damage her words had inflicted. If she truly wanted to change, she couldn't stop here. She had to do more. Her mind raced with ideas. Maybe she could donate to his nonprofit, volunteer, or use her platform to spread awareness. It wasn't just about fixing things with him. It was about fixing herself and confronting the beliefs that had led her to this moment. But just as she started to make plans, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a news alert. She clicked it, and her blood ran cold. U.S. Army hero. Attacked at local event. Authorities investigating possible hate crime. Her breath hitched as she read the details. The soldier had been speaking at a community center when a group of men had ambushed him in the parking lot. Witnesses reported hearing racial slurs before the attack, which left the soldier hospitalized. The suspects had fled the scene and were still at large. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. This man, who had already been through so much, was now facing even more hatred and violence. And for what? For being who he was? For daring to exist? The woman knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. If she truly wanted to make amends, this was her chance. She picked up her phone again, her hands shaking as she typed out a new message. "I just saw the news. Please let me help. Whatever you need. Hospital bills, legal fees, anything. I owe you that much." She hit send, her heart pounding as she waited for a reply. But this time, hours passed with no response. She checked the news obsessively, hoping for updates on his condition. The guilt that had been gnawing at her before now felt unbearable. She had been part of the problem, but she vowed to become part of the solution, no matter what it took. And then, finally, her phone buzzed again. It wasn't a message. It was a call. She stared at the screen, her breath catching as she recognized the number from his social media profile. Swallowing hard, she answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice trembling. A deep, steady voice came through the line. "This is Sergeant Williams. I heard you want to help." Her heart pounded as she replied, "Yes. Please, anything you need." There was a pause, then. "Meet me tomorrow at the community center. If you're serious, you'll show up." Before she could respond, the line went dead. She stared at her phone, her mind racing. What would he ask of her? Could she truly make amends? One thing was certain. This wasn't over. The next day, the woman sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as she stared at the community center. Her heart thudded in her chest, her palms slick with sweat. She had barely slept the night before, replaying the soldier's voice over and over in her head. "If you're serious, you'll show up." She hadn't told anyone where she was going. This wasn't about public apologies or performative gestures. It was about doing the right thing, no matter how uncomfortable it made her feel. But as she sat there, the weight of her guilt felt heavier than ever. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and walked toward the building. Inside, the center was alive with activity. Kids running in the hallways, volunteers handing out supplies, and parents chatting in small groups. The buzz of life filled the air, but her focus was solely on finding him. She spotted him in a small meeting room at the back of the building. Sergeant Williams sat at a table surrounded by papers and a few community members, his arm in a sling from the attack. Despite the visible bruises on his face, his demeanor was calm, even commanding. He exuded an air of quiet strength, and she felt a pang of shame all over again for how she had treated him. As she approached the table, he looked up, his expression unreadable. The other people at the table turned to see who had entered, and for a moment, the room fell silent. "You showed up," he said, his voice steady but not unkind. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here." He gestured to a chair across from him. "Sit." She obeyed, her heart racing as she lowered herself into the seat. The silence between them was heavy, and she struggled to find the right words. "I saw the news," she began, her voice trembling. "I can't believe what happened to you. It's disgusting, and I want to help, however I can." He studied her for a long moment, his piercing gaze making her feel as if he could see straight through her. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his injured arm resting on the table. "You say you want to help," he said. "But let me ask you this. Why? Why do you care now?" Her stomach twisted at the question. It was fair, of course. She had to own up to her past if she wanted to move forward. "Because I was wrong," she admitted, her voice cracking. "Because I was blind to my own prejudice, and I hurt you. And when I saw what happened to you, I realized I can't just apologize and move on. I have to do something. I want to be better, and I want to make things right." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he exchanged a glance with one of the people at the table, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a clipboard in her hands. The woman nodded subtly, and Sergeant Williams turned his attention back to her. "All right," he said finally. "If you're serious about helping, we'll put you to work." She blinked in surprise. "Work?" He nodded. "We're organizing a fundraiser to cover medical expenses for people who've been victims of hate crimes. The attack on me was just one incident, but this is bigger than me. If you really want to make a difference, you'll roll up your sleeves and get involved." "I'll do it," she said quickly, relief washing over her. "Whatever you need." "Good," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But let me be clear, this isn't about easing your guilt. It's about standing up for what's right. If you're here to make yourself feel better, you're wasting my time." "I understand," she said, swallowing hard. "I'm here to help, not for me, for them." For the next few hours, she worked alongside the team, helping to plan the fundraiser. She made phone calls, gathered supplies, and even volunteered to reach out to local businesses for sponsorships. The work was exhausting, but fulfilling, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was contributing to something meaningful. As the day came to an end, Sergeant Williams approached her. His expression was softer now, though still serious. "You did good today," he said. "But this is just the beginning. If you're serious about change, it's going to take more than one day." "I know," she said, meeting his gaze. "And I'm ready." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We'll see." Before she could respond, a commotion erupted near the front of the building. Raised voices echoed through the halls, followed by the sound of a door slamming. Sergeant Williams tensed, his eyes narrowing. "Stay here," he said sharply, moving toward the sound despite his injuries. But she couldn't stay put. Something told her that whatever was happening wasn't good, and she couldn't stand by and do nothing. The sound of raised voices carried down the hallway, growing louder with every second. Ignoring Sergeant Williams's warning to stay put, she hurried after him. The commotion seemed to be coming from the front lobby, where the community center's double doors stood wide open. As she rounded the corner, her heart sank. 3 men stood just inside the doorway, their aggressive postures and sneering faces instantly setting her on edge. They wore leather jackets emblazoned with the insignia of a local biker gang, one that had been notorious in the news for their racially charged violence and intimidation tactics. Sergeant Williams stood facing them, his injured arm in its sling, but his presence was commanding despite his vulnerability. He didn't flinch as the tallest of the bikers stepped forward, his finger jabbing the air between them. "This your little clubhouse, huh?" the man growled, his voice dripping with mockery. Real cozy. We don't want any trouble, Williams said evenly, though there was a sharp edge to his tone that hinted he wouldn't back down if pushed. You're trespassing. Leave now. The biker scoffed, turning to his friends with a smirk. Hear that, boys? The big man thinks he can tell us what to do. The smallest of the bikers, thin and wiry, but with a mean glint in his eye, stepped forward, glancing around the room. His gaze landed on the group of volunteers standing frozen behind Sergeant Williams, and his smirk widened. Looks like you've got yourself a little fan club, Sergeant, he sneered, dragging out the title with mock respect. You're quite the hero around here, huh? Too bad heroes don't last long. The tension in the room was suffocating. She could feel the fear radiating from the other volunteers, but she refused to let herself panic. Instead, she focused on Williams, watching as he stood firm, his jaw clenched. You've got 5 seconds to turn around and walk out of here, Williams said, his voice low and steady. 5 seconds, or I'll call the police. The tallest biker laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Go ahead, call them. I'm sure they'll love to hear how you've been stirring up trouble, playing the victim. People like you always think you can cry your way out of things. The blatant racism in his words sent a surge of anger through her, but she bit her tongue, knowing this wasn't the time to react emotionally. Beside her, one of the other volunteers, a young man with a clipboard, muttered under his breath, "This is going to get bad." Before Williams could respond, the wiry biker suddenly lunged forward, grabbing a stack of flyers from a nearby table and tossing them into the air. Hose, papers scattered like confetti, fluttering to the ground in a chaotic mess. Oops, he said with a smirk. My bad. Williams didn't flinch. Instead, he took a single step forward, his eyes locked on the biker in a way that made even the smug man hesitate. Last warning, he said, his voice like steel. Leave. Now. The bikers exchanged glances, their confidence faltering for the first time. But just as it seemed like they might back down, the tallest one leaned in close to Williams, his face twisted in a sneer. You think you're tough because you've got these people backing you up, he hissed. You're nothing. You hear me? Nothing. And then, in a move so sudden it took everyone by surprise, the biker shoved Williams hard in the chest. The sergeant staggered back, barely catching his balance with his one good arm. Gasps erupted from the volunteers, and she felt her own heart leap into her throat. But instead of falling or retaliating, Williams straightened, his expression calm, but deadly serious. He raised his hand, signaling for the others to stay back. You just made a big mistake, he said quietly, his words chilling in their simplicity. Before anyone could react, the sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder as they approached the building. The bikers froze, their bravado replaced by uncertainty. One of them cursed under his breath, glancing toward the door. Cops, the wiry one muttered. We gotta go. But the tallest biker hesitated, his gaze flicking between Williams and the approaching police cars. This isn't over, he spat. You'll regret this. With that, he turned and stalked out the door, his companions scrambling to follow. The volunteers let out a collective sigh of relief as the tension finally broke. Williams didn't relax, though. His eyes remained fixed on the door, his expression unreadable. She stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. Are you okay? He glanced at her, his jaw tight. I'm fine, he said, though the strain in his voice suggested otherwise. But this isn't over, not by a long shot. The sirens grew louder, and moments later, 2 police officers entered the building, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. Williams stepped forward to meet them, his demeanor composed but alert. As he began explaining what had happened, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The bikers might have left for now, but their parting words lingered in the air like a threat. As the police officers began taking statements from the volunteers, Sergeant Williams stood near the doorway, his eyes scanning the parking lot where the bikers had disappeared moments before. His stance was tense, and his jaw was set like granite. Though the immediate danger had passed, an unspoken weight hung in the air, one that everyone in the room could feel. She approached him cautiously, clutching the scattered flyers she had begun to pick up in an attempt to calm her trembling hands. "They'll come back, won't they?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Williams turned to her, his expression softening ever so slightly. "People like that? They don't let things go easily," he admitted. "But don't worry, I'm not going to let them intimidate us." Her heart twisted at the quiet determination in his voice. For a man who had already been through so much, fighting for his country, losing comrades, and now facing this kind of hatred back home, it seemed so unfair that he had to shoulder the burden of protecting everyone yet again. The officers, now finished with their initial investigation, approached Williams. "We'll keep a patrol car in the area for the next few days," one of them said. "But without clear evidence or a direct threat, there's not much else we can do right now." Williams nodded, though his jaw tightened. "Understood. But don't underestimate them. This isn't the first time they've pulled something like this." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before responding. "We'll do what we can, Sergeant. Stay safe." As the police left, Williams finally allowed himself a moment to exhale. He turned back to the group of volunteers, who were still clustered together, whispering nervously among themselves. "Listen up," he said, his voice carrying authority, but also reassurance. "I know what happened was scary, but we can't let people like them win. If we give in to fear, they've already succeeded. This community means something, and we're not going to let a few bullies tear it apart." His words seemed to steady the group, and a few nodded in agreement. She couldn't help but feel a swell of admiration for him. Even after being shoved, insulted, and threatened, he still stood tall, refusing to be shaken. But as the evening wore on, the unease in the pit of her stomach only grew. She couldn't stop thinking about the look on the tallest biker's face, the raw hatred in his eyes as he spat his parting words. The man wasn't bluffing. He meant every word. By the time the volunteers began packing up for the night, the weight of the day's events had taken its toll. Williams stayed behind, insisting on locking up himself. She lingered in the parking lot, reluctant to leave him alone. "Sergeant," she called out as he closed the center's door behind him, his keys jingling in his hand. "You sure you don't want someone to stick around, just in case?" He gave her a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll be fine. Go home. Get some rest. You've done enough for today." She hesitated, but eventually nodded, climbing into her car. As she drove away, she watched him in her rearview mirror, his figure silhouetted against the dim streetlights, standing alone in the empty parking lot. The next morning, the community center buzzed with activity as volunteers prepared for a fundraising event. But just as the mood began to lift, the sound of revving engines echoed through the neighborhood. Heads turned toward the windows, and the air grew thick with apprehension. "They're back," someone whispered, panic creeping into their voice. Outside, a line of motorcycles roared into the parking lot, their riders dismounting with deliberate menace. The tallest biker led the group, his sneer even more pronounced than the day before. This time they weren't alone. Several more men had joined them, their expressions grim and determined. Williams emerged from the center, his presence a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the bikers. He didn't flinch as they approached, his calm demeanor almost unnerving. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" the leader sneered, stepping forward. "We told you this wasn't over." Williams didn't respond immediately. Instead, he crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "If you're here to cause trouble, you're wasting your time. The police are already aware of you." The biker chuckled darkly, glancing at his companions. "Oh, we're not worried about the cops. You see, we've got friends in high places, people who don't like seeing guys like you getting too comfortable." The implication hung heavy in the air, and the volunteers watching from inside the center exchanged nervous glances. Williams, however, remained unfazed. "You came all the way here to make threats?" he asked, his tone almost bored. "Seems like a waste of gas." The leader's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. "You think this is funny? You think we're just playing games?" Before anyone could react, he lunged forward, grabbing Williams by the front of his shirt. Gasps erupted from the onlookers as the two men stood face to face, the tension crackling like static electricity. But Williams didn't so much as blink. Instead, he leaned in, his voice low and steady. "Let go," he said. "Unless you want to regret it." The biker hesitated, his confidence wavering for the first time. But his pride wouldn't let him back down, not in front of his crew. With a sneer, he tightened his grip. And that's when Williams moved. In a blur of motion, he twisted free, his hands a blur as he delivered a precise strike to the biker's wrist, forcing him to release his hold. Before the man could recover, Williams stepped forward, his stance shifting into one of practiced readiness. The other bikers surged forward, but Williams raised a hand, his expression cold and commanding. "Think carefully about your next move," he said, his voice like steel. For a moment, no one moved, the tension so thick it was suffocating. The bikers froze, their faces a mix of disbelief and simmering anger. The tall leader staggered back, cradling his wrist, his tough facade crumbling under the unexpected blow. He glared at Williams, his face flushing with rage. "You're gonna pay for that," he growled through gritted teeth, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. The other bikers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsettled by how easily their leader had been put in his place. Williams, however, stood firm, his stance unshaken, his eyes locked on the group with a calm intensity that spoke volumes. "I warned you," Williams said, his voice as steady as the ground beneath him. "You picked the wrong fight." But the leader wasn't about to back down, not with his pride on the line. "Get him," he barked, waving his good hand toward Williams. The other bikers hesitated for only a second, before surging forward, their boots pounding against the asphalt. Inside the center, the volunteers screamed and ducked for cover, peering nervously through the windows as chaos unfolded in the parking lot. Williams didn't flinch. His body moved like a coiled spring, reacting with precision and speed. As the first biker lunged at him, he sidestepped effortlessly, delivering a sharp elbow to the man's ribs that sent him crumpling to the ground. Another charged at him with a wild swing, but Williams ducked, countering with a clean uppercut. That left the attacker sprawled on the pavement. The remaining bikers hesitated again, clearly questioning their decision to pick this fight. But the leader, now red-faced and furious, roared, "Don't just stand there! Take him down!" The remaining bikers obeyed, rushing Williams in a frenzy. But it was like watching an artist at work. Every punch, every kick, every movement was calculated, efficient, and devastating. Williams moved like a man who had been trained for years to handle situations far more dangerous than this. And he had. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a Navy SEAL, a master of combat who had faced life-and-death situations that these men couldn't even imagine. One by one, the bikers fell, their bravado replaced with groans of pain and utter humiliation. By the time the last man hit the ground, the parking lot was eerily quiet except for the sound of heavy breathing and the faint hum of distant traffic. The tall leader, now alone and visibly shaken, stumbled backward. He looked around at his fallen crew, his bravado all but gone. You think you're some kind of hero," he stammered, his voice quivering. Williams stepped closer, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the man. "I don't care what you think I am," he said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "What I care about is making sure people like you understand that this kind of hatred won't be tolerated. Not here. Not anywhere." The leader tried to speak, but his words caught in his throat. For a moment, he looked like he might run, but before he could make a move, the sound of sirens filled the air. Everyone turned to see two police cruisers pulling into the parking lot, their lights flashing. The volunteers inside the center cheered as officers stepped out, taking in the scene of battered bikers sprawled across the ground. The tall leader turned back to Williams, his face a mixture of panic and fury. "You called the cops," he spat. Williams didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned in close, his voice low but firm. "No, they called themselves. Seems someone inside decided enough was enough." The officers approached cautiously, their hands on their holsters as they assessed the situation. One of them, a stern-looking sergeant, stepped forward. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Williams raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Self-defense," he said simply. "These men came here looking for trouble. I just made sure they didn't find it." The sergeant's eyes flicked between Williams and the defeated bikers, then landed on the tall leader. "You got anything to say for yourself?" he asked. The man's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Finally, he slumped his shoulders in defeat. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, though it was clear to everyone that, for now, it very much was. As the officers began cuffing the bikers and reading them their rights, one of the volunteers approached Williams cautiously. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Williams turned to her and gave a small, reassuring smile. "I'm fine," he said. "But more importantly, so are all of you." The volunteers began clapping, their cheers growing louder as the tension of the moment finally broke. Williams, ever humble, waved them off, but the gratitude in their eyes was impossible to miss. As the police loaded the bikers into their cruisers, the tall leader shot one last glare at Williams. "This isn't the end," he hissed. "You'll see." Williams watched as the man was shoved into the back seat of a patrol car. Then, with a calm that belied the chaos of the past hour, he turned back to the volunteers. "Let's get back to work," he said, his voice steady. "There's still a lot to do." But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The leader's words echoed in his mind, a reminder that he often doesn't give up so easily. Still, Williams was ready. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on. Follow, like, and share for more gripping stories like this.